Berlin, 1896. The city hummed with invention, iron, and ambition. Steam trains roared through stations, factory whistles split the air, and young men spoke about engines as if they were alive. Among them grew a boy who could never stop looking upward, Ernst Udet. His father, a disciplined engineer, believed in logic, formulas, and order. His mother, gentle but pragmatic, worried that her son's head was always somewhere above the clouds. From the moment Ernst could walk, he built things: toy gliders from wood, model balloons from paper. They rarely worked, but every crash only made him more determined. When the Wright brothers made their first flight in 1903, the news struck Germany like lightning. Newspapers spoke of a new age, an era where man would conquer the sky. To most people, it was fantasy. To young Udet, it was destiny. He began haunting the outskirts of Tempelhof airfield, watching the early aviators test their strange contraptions. He memorized every detail: the sputter of the engine, the smell of oil, the way the aircraft trembled before lifting into the unknown. By his late teens, Udet was restless. He tried mechanical school but found no joy in equations. What mattered to him was movement, the poetry of air and speed. He joined a local flying club, saved every mark he earned, and bought his first plane, a fragile, skeletal machine he named the Eindecker. It had no instruments, barely any safety structure, and required courage bordering on madness to fly. Udet crashed it on his second attempt, walked away unhurt, and smiled. "Now I know what it feels like," he said. Flying in those years was closer to art than science. Every pilot was an inventor, every takeoff an experiment. Udet had an instinctive talent. His turns were smooth, his dives fearless, his sense of balance uncanny. He could feel the plane breathe beneath him. It was not about control, it was about harmony. But behind his enthusiasm lingered something darker, a refusal to obey, a restlessness that made him both brilliant and impossible to command. He disliked authority, mocked discipline, and once told an instructor that the only order he followed was gravity. Even then, his future in any structured military system seemed uncertain. In cafes around Berlin, he began meeting other young enthusiasts, men who shared the same fever for the air. They spoke about the rumors from across the border, Europe arming itself, a storm gathering. Udet laughed it off. He didn't think of war, only of wings and engines, but history was moving faster than his dreams. By the summer of 1914, the sound of marching boots drowned the hum of aerodromes. Germany mobilized, and the sky, once a playground for dreamers, became a battlefield. Udet, 18 and brimming with youthful bravado, saw an opportunity rather than a threat. If the world was to burn, he wanted to burn above it. When he tried to enlist, the army laughed. "Too short, too frail," they said. But Ernst was relentless. He used his savings to continue flying privately until, eventually, his skill drew attention. The military could not ignore his precision, his reflexes, and that unteachable sense of balance. Against the odds, he was accepted into the Imperial Air Service. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "The air is where I belong. I fear nothing up there, only the moment when I must land again." That sentence captured him perfectly. The restless boy turned pilot, chasing a freedom no earth could hold. And as he prepared for his first flight in uniform, he still believed flying was about beauty, not death. He was wrong. That illusion, that purity of flight, would vanish the moment he met another plane in combat. When war erupted in 1914, the air was still a novel element of battle. Most nations saw airplanes as scouts, not weapons. Yet, for a few daring souls, the sky promised something more, a new frontier where courage could be measured in altitude and speed. Among them was Ernst Udet, barely 19, too small for infantry service, too stubborn to stay grounded. After several rejections, he found a way in, first as a mechanic, then as a trainee pilot. The machines were fragile, wood, canvas, and wires trembling under the wind. Instructors shouted through roaring engines, and every mistake could end in flames. Yet Udet learned quickly. He was reckless but precise, guided by instinct more than doctrine. The air tells you everything, he would say later, if you learn to listen. By 1915, the war above the trenches had changed. Observation turned to combat. Pistols were tied to frames, rifles clamped to wings. Then came synchronized guns, and suddenly, duels of life and death were fought in silence at 3,000 meters. Udet watched comrades vanish in smoke, replaced by new faces the next week. He understood that bravery was not glory, it was survival. His first engagement was chaos. A French voisin appeared out of the mist. Bullets cut through his wing, and for a moment he froze. Training fled. Then, instinct took over. A sharp dive, a turn, a burst of fire. The enemy fell. Udet landed shaking, exhilarated and sick. He had lived his dream and killed it in the same instant. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Udet was fearless. In truth, he was terrified every time he took off, not of death, but of failure. He began studying every maneuver of his idols, especially the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, whose scarlet plane ruled the front. Udet wrote to him, half in admiration, half in envy, confessing that he wanted to learn how to fly beautifully, even when killing. When Richthofen invited him to join Jagdgeschwader I, the flying circus, Udet's life changed. The unit was a theatre of colour and death, bright aircraft, decorated tents, laughter that ended in silence by nightfall. He fit in perfectly. His acrobatics thrilled comrades, his precision astonished commanders. Yet behind each victory he felt something fading, the simple joy that first drew him to the sky. He kept flying, higher and faster, trying to recapture that moment before the guns, before the orders, before the war turned flight into murder. Each mission earned him another medal, another scar, another sleepless night. By the end of 1917, Ernst Udet was an ace, respected and admired. But as he looked down upon the ruined fields of Europe, he began to realize a truth that would haunt him forever. The sky he had conquered was no longer free. It belonged to the war, and the war would never let him go. When Ernst Udet joined Manfred von Richthofen's Jagdgeschwader I, the fabled flying circus, he entered a world unlike any other in the war. It was a strange mixture of elegance and death. The bright colours of the planes, reds, blues, yellows, cut across the grey sky of the Western Front like strokes of rebellion. Pilots painted their machines as knights once carved their shields. Inside the tents they laughed, drank, told stories. By dawn, half of them were gone. Udet quickly earned his place among them. His flying was a spectacle, graceful, daring, precise. He could loop, dive and climb with uncanny control, turning combat into performance. Richthofen recognized his talent and told him, almost prophetically, "You will be one of us, but never like us. You fly for joy, not for war." Udet took it as a compliment. Only later did he understand it was a warning. By early 1918, his reputation was immense. Newspapers called him the Red Eagle, celebrating every victory as a symbol of German spirit. The public saw a hero. Udet saw ghosts. For every enemy he downed, another friend vanished from formation. The air that once sang to him now whispered names he didn't want to remember. Then came a mission that would mark him forever. His squadron was ordered to intercept a group of Allied bombers over the Marne. Clouds closed around them, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Through the mist, he spotted one of his wingmen losing altitude, spiralling helplessly toward enemy fire. Udet hesitated only for a heartbeat. Orders said attack. Instinct said save him. He dove. The storm swallowed them both. When he finally returned to base, drenched and trembling, his friend was gone. The others congratulated him for surviving, but he couldn't celebrate. That night he wrote in his logbook, "The sky does not forgive choices. It only remembers what you lose." Richthofen's death followed weeks later, a bullet through the chest during a low chase over France. When the news reached the squadron, silence replaced their usual bravado. For Udet it was more than grief. It was the collapse of a world he believed in. Richthofen had represented something pure, almost chivalric, a belief that even in war there could be honour. With him gone, the air itself felt corrupted. Still, Udet kept flying. Each takeoff was an act of defiance against despair. He led missions, mentored younger pilots, and fought with unmatched precision. Yet beneath the medals and triumphs, he was hollowing out. He once said to a fellow ace, "We're not flying anymore, we're falling, slowly, and pretending it's control." By the time the armistice drew near, he was among the highest-scoring surviving German aces. To his country he was immortal. To himself, he was already fading. The boy who once saw flight as freedom now knew the truth. The sky could give life, but it could also take everything from those who loved it too much. When the guns finally fell silent, Udet stood beside his aircraft, listening to the wind. For the first time, he didn't want to fly. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Ernst Udet was 22 years old and already one of Germany's most celebrated pilots. But victory had turned to defeat, and the empire he had fought for no longer existed. The red eagle of the skies came back to earth, to a homeland broken, hungry, and humiliated. Crowds greeted returning soldiers with silence. The medals pinned to his uniform felt like relics of a vanished world. At first he tried to adapt. He found work as a mechanic, then as a mail pilot, carrying letters over the fractured landscape of the Weimar Republic. The missions were peaceful but empty. No one cared for heroes anymore. They cared for bread. Udet missed the wind, the danger, the rhythm of combat. It was not the killing he craved, but the feeling of flight, that moment when fear and freedom became the same thing. He soon discovered a new stage, the air show. In the early 1920s, aviation had become a spectacle, and Udet was its brightest star. He performed impossible stunts, loops just meters above the ground, vertical climbs that ended in elegant dives. Crowds gasped. Photographers adored him. In America, he toured with barnstormers, dazzling audiences who had never seen a plane up close. He flew, one journalist wrote, as if gravity were a rumor he refused to believe. But applause, like altitude, never lasted. Between shows, Udet drifted from one city to another, drinking heavily, living fast. He surrounded himself with friends and admirers, but the laughter ended when the engines stopped. He fell in love often, actresses, artists, women drawn to the legend. Yet every romance ended the same way, with Udet retreating to the sky, when no one could reach him. As the decade passed, Germany changed again. The economy collapsed, streets filled with anger, flags and marching boots. Udet returned home to a nation searching for its past glory, and to men who saw him not as a relic, but as a symbol. His fame gave him access to power, his pride made him vulnerable to it. The new regime promised to restore Germany's wings, and they wanted Udet to be part of it. He didn't believe in politics. He believed in engines, in airframes, in flight. When he was asked to demonstrate aircraft for military officials, he accepted, not out of ideology, but out of nostalgia. The roar of the engine still silenced his doubts. "When I fly," he once told a friend, "the world below stops mattering." Yet beneath the thrill, something darker stirred. The men who now praised him were not dreamers or engineers. They spoke of war as rebirth, of conquest as destiny. Udet didn't argue. He was tired, aging, and unsure of where else to go. He thought he could stay above it, as he always had. But the sky he loved was changing again. It was no longer a place of freedom. It was becoming, once more, a weapon. And soon, Ernst Udet, the boy who had once built paper wings in his father's workshop, would find himself helping to forge the wings of a new and terrible empire. By the early 1930s, Germany was a nation in search of redemption. Factories lay silent, the people humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Yet one man promised to restore the country's pride, and with it, its wings. Hermann Goering, once a fighter ace himself, sought out Ernst Udet. He needed a face that symbolized the fearless spirit of old German aviation. Udet hesitated. Politics disgusted him, but flight was irresistible. He accepted. In 1935, the Luftwaffe was born in secret, rising from the ashes of forbidden dreams. Udet became its chief of procurement and technical development, a grand title for a man who had never liked bureaucracy. He believed he could steer aviation toward innovation, perhaps even peace. But the system was already poisoned. Engineers competed for influence, officers schemed for favour, and every design was measured not in beauty or performance, but in how effectively it could kill. Udet tried to bring creativity to the chaos. He admired new technologies, dive bombers, automatic flaps, precision engineering. Yet for every idea he nurtured, a political order came back stamped with Goering's seal. The Luftwaffe grew rapidly, not as a brotherhood of pilots but as an instrument of ideology. "We are not builders," Udet once muttered during a meeting. "We are craftsmen of destruction." The pressure mounted. Goering demanded impossible production goals. Hitler demanded miracles. Udet drank to stay calm, then drank to forget. He was torn between two worlds, the dreamer who once danced through clouds and the official trapped behind a desk, signing orders that sent thousands to die. Letters from the front reached his office, written by young men who had grown up idolizing him. They spoke of admiration and of fear. When the war began in 1939, Udet's optimism collapsed. The Luftwaffe's triumphs in Poland and France seemed at first to vindicate him, but he knew the truth behind the statistics. Underfunded production lines, exhausted pilots, overconfidence bred by propaganda. By 1941, as the Eastern Front devoured aircraft and men alike, he saw his worst fears realized. "We built wings for vultures," he told a confidant. His personal life deteriorated with the war. Sleep eluded him. Alcohol no longer numbed the guilt. Goering blamed him for technical failures, while the Führer dismissed him as weak. Once, after a disastrous meeting about dive bomber shortages, Udet returned home, locked the door, and spent hours tinkering with model airplanes, the same kind he had built as a boy. It was the last time anyone saw him smile. In November 1941, the pressure finally broke him. Reports differ on what happened that morning. Some say he argued with Goering, others that he received news of another failed operation. His housekeeper later recalled hearing a gunshot from his study. On the desk lay a revolver, a bottle of cognac, and a note. "See you soon, my dear Lowe," addressed to his mistress. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, many suspected otherwise. At his funeral, the regime turned tragedy into theatre. The casket was draped in swastikas, speeches praised his loyalty, and Goering stood over the grave of the man he had driven to despair. The papers called Udet a national hero, the embodiment of German courage. But those who knew him understood the truth. He had not died for Germany. He had died because the sky he once loved had become a cage. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe began to crumble, and with it the myth of Ernst Udet. Yet among the few who remembered him as he truly was, the memory lingered. A brilliant pilot, flawed and fragile, who tried to make the air a sanctuary, and found in the end that even the heavens could be corrupted by men. When the war ended in 1945, Germany was a graveyard of cities and souls. Its skies, once filled with the roar of engines and smoke, were silent. The name Ernst Udet lingered only faintly, buried beneath ruins and guilt. To the victors, he was part of the Nazi war machine, a man who had served Goering and built the Luftwaffe. To many Germans, he was a reminder of things they wished to forget. The Red Eagle had fallen, and the world moved on without him. For years, his legacy was left in the shadows. The Allied tribunals mentioned him briefly, mostly as a footnote in the hierarchy of the Luftwaffe. His suicide was portrayed as weakness, his achievements dismissed as propaganda. But beneath the official silence, pilots, both friend and foe, still spoke his name with a strange mix of admiration and pity. Udet flew like no one else, one British ace recalled. He was born to fly, but he lived in the wrong century. In the 1950s, as the smoke of history began to clear, historians and aviators started to look again at the man behind the myth. They found letters, notebooks, technical sketches, fragments of a restless mind. Udet had been more than a warrior. He was an engineer, an innovator, a man obsessed with the mechanics of grace. His contributions to aviation, from dive brake systems to automatic control flaps, quietly shaped generations of aircraft that came after him. Even his reckless air shows in the 1920s inspired new standards for aerobatic flight. Yet what defined him was not invention, but contradiction. Udet was both hero and victim, genius and runaway. He despised war, but helped build one of its deadliest weapons. He dreamed of beauty in flight, but was crushed by the politics of the earth. That paradox haunted his memory. In post-war Germany, official historians avoided his name. Veterans whispered it with sadness. To them, he represented something purer, the old spirit of aviation, before it was consumed by ideology. Over time, the story softened. Biographers began to separate Udet the engineer from Udet the symbol. They wrote of a man undone not by defeat, but by conscience. In the 1960s, documentaries used his early footage, the smiling pilot looping across clear skies, long before the world burned, to remind audiences that history's villains were sometimes dreamers trapped in the wrong hands. Today, few remember him clearly. His name appears in museums, on faded photographs, in the quiet corners of aviation history. But among pilots, his influence survives, not as propaganda, but as instinct. Every flyer who rolls through a perfect dive or balances on the edge of a stall traces, unknowingly, the legacy of Ernst Udet. He remains a warning and a wonder, a man who touched the heavens only to discover that the higher one flies, the further there is to fall. And in the end, that was his tragedy. Not that he fell, but that he could never stop chasing the sky.